Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, slower corner of early America. It's the 1630s, an era when people were still figuring out what exactly the New World was, and when a good mattress meant a pile of straw that didn't have too many fleas in it. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pull your blanket up just a little higher. We're heading into the misty forests and muddy clearings of colonial New England, where a handful of Puritans trudged westward to found what would become the colony, and eventually the state, of Connecticut. It's not the most glamorous of the original colonies. It wasn't full of swashbuckling explorers or flashy gold mines. But it did have something arguably more interesting. A small cluster of deeply anxious Englishmen who were convinced they could build the perfect godly society, if only they could find the right patch of cold, mosquito-filled wilderness. Naturally, they didn't. A Puritan Road Trip, 1636 edition. Our story begins in Massachusetts Bay, where the Puritans had been busy trying to create their shining city on a hill. Unfortunately, as tends to happen in shining cities, a few residents started to disagree about who, exactly, was allowed to shine and how much shining was too much. Among them was Thomas Hooker, a preacher, and one of those people who somehow manages to sound both inspiring and slightly exhausting at the same time. Hooker was a learned man, Cambridge educated, with a voice that could apparently move a crowd to tears or terror in about 3 sentences. But, like most religious men of the 17th century, he was not exactly big on chill. Hooker's core belief was that government should rest on the consent of the governed. This sounds nice and democratic now, but in 1636, it was about as radical as suggesting the colonies should have a casual Friday. The Puritan leadership in Boston found Hooker's ideas dangerously liberal, not because he wanted freedom for all, but because he thought maybe the rich shouldn't get to run everything all the time. The governor, John Winthrop, wasn't pleased. Winthrop was one of those men who could use the word liberty in a sentence and still sound vaguely threatening. When Hooker and his followers started talking about moving west, Winthrop didn't exactly stop them. He basically said, "Well, if you're so smart, go found your own perfect town." And so they did. In June of 1636, Hooker led about 100 people, men, women, and children, on a 2-week trek through the wilderness from Newtown, modern-day Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the fertile valley along the Connecticut River. They brought with them their livestock, household goods, and the kind of optimism that usually precedes frostbite. Imagine the scene. Lines of ox carts creaking through dense forest, families sleeping under the stars, mosquitoes the size of walnuts. There were no roads, only trails left by indigenous peoples and day, and every crossing over a river meant hauling wagons through waist-deep water. But they trudged on, motivated by faith in the promise of a place where everyone could worship freely, so long as they agreed on what freely meant. When they arrived, they founded Hartford, a name they probably came up with while too tired to think of anything else. A land already lived on. Now, the problem with declaring an empty new settlement is that it rarely is. The Connecticut River Valley was home to Algonquian-speaking tribes, including the Wanganks, Podunks, and Pequods, who had been there for generations. They hunted, fished, and farmed the land long before anyone named Thomas Hooker decided to build a Puritan utopia on top of it. The settlers did what European colonists often did in such situations. They negotiated treaties that were creative, at best. They purchased land with items like cloth, hatchets, and beads, which the English saw as legitimate payment, and the tribes often saw as gestures of friendship, not permanent transfers of territory. Predictably, this misunderstanding would lead to several small skirmishes and one very large, unpleasant conflict later known as the Pequot War. But for now, in 1636, Hooker's band was mostly focused on building houses, planting crops, and trying to keep everyone alive through the winter, which, as they would soon learn, was less picturesque snowfall and more how many potatoes do we have left. Still, they survived, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for one of the first places in the Western world to write down a sort of constitution, the Fundamental Orders. In January of 1639, Hooker and the leaders of Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield gathered to formalize how their new colony should be governed. They didn't call it a constitution, because that would have been too bold. Instead, they humbly titled it the Fundamental Orders, which sounds like a very stained breakfast menu. The document set out the basic rules of government, elections for magistrates, limits on power, and the principle that authority comes from the people, or at least from the people who were allowed to vote, which was not exactly everyone. But still, for its time, it was revolutionary. Some historians even call it the first written constitution in the world. That might be overstating it a little. The ancient Greeks would probably like a word, but it was certainly a step toward the democratic ideals that would later shape the United States. Hooker himself put it succinctly: the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people. That line would echo through American political thought for centuries, though the immediate effect was that Boston now viewed Hooker as the annoying cousin who won't stop quoting himself at dinner. Trouble on the horizon, the Pequot War. As the Connecticut settlers built their tidy Puritan towns, tensions with the Pequot tribe escalated. The Pequots were a powerful people controlling trade along the lower Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. The English, never known for subtlety in colonial diplomacy, wanted that trade for themselves. In 1636, after a series of violent incidents between traders and tribes, Massachusetts and Connecticut declared war on the Pequots. This was, as wars go, poorly planned. The Puritans had no standing army, no maps, and very few soldiers who could tell one tribe from another. They relied heavily on alliances with rival indigenous groups, particularly the Narragansetts and Mohegans, who saw an opportunity to weaken their old enemies. The war culminated in 1637 with the Mystic Massacre, one of the darker episodes in early colonial history. English forces surrounded a Pequot village near Mystic, Connecticut, set it on fire, and killed hundreds of men, women, and children as they tried to flee. The settlers called it a victory and thanked God for his providence, because of course they did. By the end of the war, the Pequot people were nearly annihilated. Survivors were enslaved, sold to the West Indies, or absorbed into other tribes. It was a grim beginning for a colony that had been founded on supposedly higher moral principles. Still, to the Puritans, this destruction was proof that they were building a divinely sanctioned society. It's a bit like congratulating yourself on passing a test after you've burned down the school. Life in early Connecticut. After the war, Connecticut slowly stabilized. Settlements grew. More colonists arrived from England, eager to escape religious oppression, only to recreate it, with minor variations, in their new homes. Daily life in the colony was, by modern standards, profoundly dull. Work began at dawn. Sundays were consumed by sermons that could last several hours. There was little in the way of entertainment, unless you counted public punishment, which the Puritans very much did. If you were caught gossiping, you might be forced to wear a wooden tongue tied around your neck. If you skipped church, you could be fined. And if you questioned the minister's interpretation of scripture, you might find yourself politely told to leave town. And yet, for all its repression, Connecticut thrived. Its river valleys were fertile. Trade expanded, and in time, it attracted settlers less concerned with theology and more with things like making money and not freezing to death. Still, religion remained at the heart of everything. Even the colony's leaders were expected to demonstrate personal holiness, though their understanding of holiness often involved yelling at people about card games. Hooker's twilight years. Thomas Hooker spent his final years in Hartford, preaching, advising, and occasionally feuding with other ministers over fine theological points that now sound like hair-splitting contests. He was respected, if not exactly loved, the kind of man whose gravitas could silence a room, but who you probably wouldn't invite to your birthday. In 1647, he died of what records vaguely call an epidemic, which could mean almost anything from influenza to the general filthiness of 17th century living. He was around 61 years old, a respectable age, given that half his congregation probably thought bathing was a sign of vanity. After his death, the colony carried on under his intellectual shadow. His influence lingered not only in sermons but in the political framework he'd helped design, one that valued consent, representation, and law over pure religious authority. That balance would later set Connecticut apart when it joined the other colonies in the movement toward independence. For now, though, it remained a small, self-contained world, earnest, devout, occasionally self-righteous, and still half convinced that God cared deeply about the exact length of a man's hair. The charter that wouldn't die. By the 1660s, Connecticut was thriving enough to attract royal attention, which, in the 17th century, was rarely good news. King Charles II issued the colony a royal charter in 1662, confirming its rights and boundaries. It was a generous document, giving Connecticut more autonomy than most colonies had. Naturally, they cherished it like a family heirloom. Then, when James II came to the throne in 1685, he decided that all those separate colonial governments were far too independent for his liking. He sent Sir Edmund Andros, the deeply unpopular royal governor of New England, to consolidate them under one authority. When Andros arrived in Hartford in 1687 to seize Connecticut's charter, local leaders did what any reasonable people would do. They stalled. There was a long, tense meeting that evening, during which someone, possibly accidentally, extinguished the candles. When the lights came back on, the charter was gone. Legend says it had been spirited away and hidden inside the charter oak, a large tree that stood near Hartford. Whether that actually happened or not is debatable, but it makes for a good story, and colonial Connecticut loved a good story almost as much as it loved passive-aggressively ignoring royal orders. When Andros was overthrown a few years later, the charter was triumphantly rediscovered, and Connecticut simply carried on as though nothing had happened. It's hard not to admire that level of bureaucratic stubbornness. Drifting to the edge of the century, by the end of the 1600s, Connecticut had become a model of steady, if somewhat joyless, colonial life. Its towns were neat and orderly, its ministers prolific, and its people suspiciously fond of lawsuits. Neighbors sued each other over everything: stray pigs, damaged fences, unpaid debts, and occasionally, just for the fun of it, the Puritan dream of a perfect society hadn't quite materialized, but it had settled into something more sustainable. A small, respectable colony where work was constant, faith was serious, and excitement was to be avoided whenever possible. Still, the ideals Hooker had preached, that government should answer to its people, continued to ripple quietly through Connecticut's political culture. And in a century and a half, those ideas would find new life in the founding documents of an entire nation. But that's for another night. For now, let's leave Thomas Hooker and his weary followers in their modest town by the river, a place built on hope, hypocrisy, and hard work, where every sermon lasted too long, and every citizen, somehow, believed they were doing God's will. Let's drift onward, next time, to another colony, another grand human experiment conducted with equal parts faith, ambition, and confusion.